From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Today we're having Dorie McCullough Lawson. She is the author of the novel Along Comes a Stranger. Her first book was Posterity, Letters of Great Americans to Their Children, an anthology of the words and wisdom of 68 Americans, including Ansel Adams, Thomas Edison, Sam Houston, Mary Todd Lincoln, Groucho Marx, Clare, Boothe, Luce, and Laura Ingalls Wilder. Her newest work for children is Texts. I want you to welcome Dorie McCullough Lawson. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here today and grateful to Dr. Billington and the Library of Congress for all that you do for books. We heard last night that the National Book Festival has 1,000 volunteers, 600 of whom are employees of the Library of Congress who give their time on the weekend to come and do this for all of us. And I'd like to thank all of the volunteers for what they're doing. When my oldest daughter, Rosie, was about 4 years old, she and I went out after dinner and for a walk around our neighborhood. And it was a quiet, nice little walk. We weren't talking much and sort of lost in our own thoughts. And suddenly she stopped and slumped her shoulders and sighed like this. And I was sort of surprised. I said, "Honey, what's wrong?" And she said, "I just don't know when I'm ever going to meet Henny Penny." And I wish at that time we'd had the National Book Festival because I might have had an answer for her about when she just might be able to meet Henny Penny. Everyone here is a reader and lover of books or we wouldn't be here. So we all know that how characters in books we read and scenes we read become a part of who we are. And that happens throughout our lives. I know that I would be a different person without Antonia Shimerda or without Zena and Ethan Frome or without Russell Banks's Wade Whitehouse and Avery Boone. The characters we meet in books take hold of us very, very young, if we're lucky. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a family where I had two perfect parents, an older sister, 3 brothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. But I also was able to grow up with Huge Harold and Ferdinand the Bull and Mr. McGregor and Billy and Blaze and that little jerk, Maisie the Lazy Bird. They were all as much a part of my consciousness as the people who were really around me. Those characters who become part of our lives in the very young time are especially important because they stay with you forever. And they get there first, and they just stay there. So we all have to be very careful, I think, with our children about what we're putting into their heads with what they read. They should be reading the best. There's really no time or room to allow for anything in that precious brain space that's filler or is just sort of vulgar and fresh and all of that. I think we just really have to be sure to put in the best. I know that sometimes in schools, in my experience with schools, I've heard people say occasionally, especially with a child who is not very interested in reading, let them read anything just to get them to read. And I really disagree. Don't read them anything. There's so much that's so wonderful, and read them the best all the time, and eventually they'll come around and they'll get it. The other thing is that even when we're reading the best to our children, what they really are hearing and how they interpret it, we don't always really know. And I have an example from my own childhood about one story that I heard and what I thought it meant. We always read The Night Before Christmas on Christmas Eve, and my father would read it, or the youngest reader in the family would read the book. And I loved it. But there was a middle part that I found confusing and kind of gross, and I didn't understand any of it. The beginning was Christmas, and then it gets gross, and then it comes back to Christmas. And I was relieved when it get back to Christmas. So the confusing part is when they say reading along, and it's Ma in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our brains. How do you settle a brain? I mean, do you take it out of the head? Is it gooey? Do you tuck it in? What do you do to settle a brain? And I just would think about that, and then we'd move on to the next part. And they just settled in for a long winter's nap. And I would think, wait a minute, it's night. Who naps at night? You don't nap at night, and it's a long nap. So maybe in the olden days, and in England, I thought it must be in England because Winnie the Pooh and Peter Pan and everything were in England, so they must be in England. So maybe in the old days and in England, they hibernated like bears. So Christmas was a time when you started to hibernate then. And then we get to the worst part. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters, and threw up the sash. What was he doing eating that thing that was around my mother's bathrobe? And of course, if you ate that, you would throw up. So when we get back out to the snow and outside and reindeers and Santa, I always had a huge sigh of relief because it was back to normal and what I thought, and I just wouldn't think about that anymore. I'm not sure that Clement Moore ever could have predicted that reaction to his poem. And nor can any of us really know how what we're reading is being interpreted by the children as we're reading it. So we have to read the best and always hope for the best. I'm here today with my new book, Tex, and it's my first book for children, which I'm very excited about, and it's for little children, sort of 3 to 5-year-old children. And this book is the story of a little boy who lives near the ocean but imagines that he's a cowboy. And it starts out with somewhat of a Wizard of Oz effect, where the first photographs are black and white and they're small. And this is the real boy before he goes to his imagination. And when he moves over into his imagination and he becomes the cowboy, the photographs are big and they're all in color, and it's the imagined becomes much more real than the real. And there's a wonderful time in children's lives, and it's very short, when they're able to imagine these amazing things, but they don't seem to discern the difference between what they're imagining and the real world. They become the ballerina, they become the cowboy. And it's a time that really doesn't last long, but I love it, and I want more of it, and I want it to last longer. We can't ever stress enough the importance of imagination. And when I'm talking about imagination, what I'm talking about is imagination versus fantasy. There's certainly a place for fantasy, and our children get plenty of it in talking sponges and talking trains and unicorns and avatars and wizards. And they love it, and it's terrific, but it's not what interests me. I'm interested in imagination that propels us, adults, a country, children, the imagination that propels us forward. We need imagination to come up with new medicines. We need it to build tunnels. We need it for a scientist to look at the skeleton of a rabbit and come up with a new theory of evolution looking at those bones. It all takes imagination. You need imagination to get a 2-year-old who's having a ball in the bathtub out of the bathtub and into the pajamas and into the bed. You have to have imagination every day, and we need to help our children to develop that imagination and make it work very well. One way that I think, and I really like to try to do in my own life and with my own children, is to keep, for the little child especially, to keep their world small. Keep what they're seeing and what they're exposed to very small and simple. Don't show them the whole world all at once. It's just too much. And they need time for those imaginations to go to work on simple things like making something beautiful, or thinking about what kind of work they may do one day, or helping someone, or having something funny happen to them. Tex, in my story, is a man of few words. And I say man because he is a man. He might only be 3 feet tall, or maybe less, but he's a man, and you can see it by the way he acts. And the real boy is dreaming about when he is Tex is not a fantasy of being in a rodeo and doing very dramatic things that cowboys might do, but it's about work. It's about the work he might do one day. So I think what I'll do, I'll read you texts, and then we'll open it up for questions. But before I do that, I want to give you a quote from a hero of mine, Charlotte Mason. And Charlotte Mason was a 19th century educator in England. She was a teacher, and she started a school. And she wrote extensively about education for particularly the little child. And 100 years ago, she worried that England was becoming a child-pandering culture that was to the detriment of society and to children. And she said this: children are so sated with wonders that nothing surprises them and nothing interests them. And I'd like to imagine if she could see the wonders, good and bad, that our children are sated with today, day in and day out, what she would think. And I'm amazed at how those words, that she was worried about that 100 years ago, and it's the same concern that we have now, and we need to be worried about even more. So I want us all to keep reading to our children and try hard to allow them to have a world where their imaginations really might go to work. Now I'm going to read you from Tex. Tex. This is Luke. He lives in a house near the ocean with his mother, his father, his big sister, his big brother, his little sister, and his 2 dogs. But Luke imagines he is Tex. Tex loves mountains and wide open spaces. Tex works at the Wymont Ranch. He sleeps in a bunkhouse. See if any people can see. He has a good old cow dog named Sue. All day long, Tex works hard. He rides. He irrigates. He checks fence. He rounds up the herd. Sometimes Tex works with Cowboy Jim. I love this picture because Cowboy Jim didn't care one bit whether Tex was working with him or not. If he was there to work, he'd work, and whether he was a little kid or not didn't matter. Tex takes good care of his horse, Thunder. Thunder is Tex's best friend. Sometimes Tex even brings Thunder into the ranch house. So if you can't see the picture here, the pony's in the house. Then it's back outside for more work and a little rest. It's been a long day for a cowboy. So long, Tex. Good night, Luke. Now, as every parent knows, at this age, 3 to 5, you want the story to end with going to sleep. And it does. So I think I'll open it up for questions. Anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer. They'd like you to come to the microphones so that everybody can hear your question when you ask a question. Yes, sir.
Well, it's on now. When you were reading the story just now, I'm delighted that you actually made a story that's not just about him in a fantasy world doing, like you said, in the rodeo and everything. It's him working and it's him imagining it and not just going to the fantasy world. It starts with him in the real world. It then transfers. But I've read your first book, Posterity, and I was just wondering what influenced you to move from that genre maybe to this a kid's book? What inspired you to start writing a kid's book? Like,
Well, that
text?
is a fantastic question. Thank you very much. I have a feeling you could probably come up here and answer it better than I do. Well, I did Posterity, which is a collection of letters from great Americans over a 300-year period, and I chose about 100 letters where the American had to be great, and they had to be imparting some kind of wisdom to their child, or the letter would be revealing something about the great American who wrote the letter, something about their character or the time in which they lived. I did Posterity, then I wrote a novel, and now I've done a children's book. And I think what I need to do now is a cookbook and a self-help book, and maybe a business book, and then I'll have it all covered. So the answer to your question is, I don't think to myself, what book am I going to write? What do I want to do next? I live my life, I go to my job, I raise my children, and then once in a while, no, actually very often, I have ideas. I think about the ideas a lot, and when the idea gets to a point where I can't stop thinking about it anymore, then I try to make it into a book. And this one, I had the idea, and it started just with a photograph of the little boy, and I knew how much, and the little boy who is my son, but I knew how much he loved to work, and I started to think about that, and that gave me the idea, and then I moved on. But I don't think, do I want to write for children or do I want to write a novel? I just go with whatever the idea is. Thanks for your question. It's a good one. Yes?
What inspired you to write a book about a Texas boy?
Well, I have this little boy who, for 2 years, was Tex. And I lived with Tex. And I first met him, he was coming out of Corral West Ranchwear in Wyoming. And he had on a big black hat, and he had Wranglers, which is a kind of Western clothes, from his wrist to his ankle, and he had a leather-tooled belt and worn-out cowboy boots. And he came out onto the main street, and he had a swagger. He was a serious cowboy. And I said, "Hey, cowboy, what's your name?" And he said, "Tex." And so I lived with this man for quite a while and got to know him, and I realized that he would be a good subject for a book. Also, the West, I don't know if you've ever been to the West, is beautiful. And some of the scenery that I was able to photograph was so beautiful. And I was able, because of some friends of ours who have a working ranch, the little boy was able to do so many things that they really do on ranches in a real way. It wasn't pretend, and he wasn't posing for the photographs. He really was doing it, and I was following him around and trying to capture his time there. And that's what made me want to write about a cowboy. And also, don't you love cowboys? Cowboys are great. Thank you.
You struck a nerve with me when you were talking about imagination. I have a 26-year-old animation student son who still plays with Legos, and I've just noticed that he's still in that gap. And I've noticed that he plays all the time. He hasn't lost his childlike sense of wonder, and I wondered your thoughts about keeping in us grown-ups, keeping this imagination flowing.
How to do it?
Yeah,
well, you probably have how did you do it?
One day he was about 4, and I hadn't seen him for about an hour, and I found him in his room with about 50 books. And I said, "James, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm just turning pages." And he came home for Christmas last year from college, and I said, "Honey, can't we donate these Legos?" He says, "Oh no, look at this rocket. Don't ever take it apart." And he's very childlike, but not childish, but he has this childlike wonder that he still fosters.
Right. Well, I think that you can have the childlike wonder, which is terrific to keep fostering, and then it can stay that way, but it also can develop along into something else where we're creating things.
Medicine
and I had the opportunity this morning with my son to talk with Bill Joyce, who will be speaking at the end of the day today. And somehow they got on the topic of Nerf guns. And Bill Joyce plays with Nerf guns all the time. And the two of them went back and forth a lot about how you manipulate the spring to make it shoot harder, and they were giving each other Nerf gun tips. So it's a terrific thing if it can last and keep it going.
I know, and I think it's from play. Just keep playing.
Playing and have time. They need time. The little children especially, we're also overscheduled and I think too involved in sports and organized sports, and I think they just need more time. I just read that the United States Youth Soccer Association in 1974 had about 60,000 members. It now has 3.2 million. And it's wonderful that they're doing sports and they're playing, but the schedule that it puts children in, and with parents involved so much, they're not, I don't think, having enough time to just roll around and play.
Well, I'm just too serious of an adult, and so I'm trying to squeeze some play into my day.
Good luck. Yes.
When did you do your first book?
When did I do my first book? Well, my very first book I did when I was 9. And it was never published, but I wrote it and I illustrated it, and it was about mice who lived in the White House. And I don't know where it is now, but I love doing it. But my very first book that I had published, I started to work on not until I was 30 years old. And it was the book Posterity. And I really didn't want to write a book, but I had that idea, and it was bothering me so much. And I wanted my father to do it. And he didn't want to. I told him the idea, and he said, "Oh, that's a great idea. That's great. Oh, that's a terrific idea. Yeah, it's great." And then after a while, I realized he's not going to do it. And I wanted the book to be done, so I thought if it's going to get done, I have to do it myself. So I did it. All right. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.